welcome to a demonstration of CodeFuse's test management and maintenance features. Let's log in. To begin with, we're going to create some demonstration data by navigating to the BBC website, creating a step set which we'll call BBC homepage validation. Now we're just going to keep this simple and add two steps. One, we'll just check the text of the news tab. Simply click on that tab. So we can now return to the console, and we can see that our new step set has been created there. So the first part of our demonstration here will be we can create a new test and the test will simply have one step set in it, which was the step set that we just created. So this is a very simple test that goes in and checks the text of the BBC News tab and clicks on that tab. Now what we're trying to demonstrate here though is the reuse of those step sets. So let's create another test. And we'll add in another step set, just any at random that we've created before, and we can save that new test. Now what this has demonstrated is the reusability of test assets within CodeFuse. We now have two tests, BBC Test 123 and BBC Test 456. Both of which use the BBC homepage validation step set. Now any changes that are made to that step set in future will be reflected in both those tests, so it minimises the maintenance across all of your different tests. You can reuse that step set in multiple tests as well. It's also worth pointing out, just saving that test first, it's also worth pointing out that the objects that were created during our test can be reused. So the news tab item, when we were using the test assistant to create our step set, it stored BBC Home News tab with an XPath, there's no object ID and a CSS selector. So in future tests we can make use of those objects so that they don't get repeated, and the same is true for the data items as well. You can also do, from a reuse point of view, or reducing maintenance, is rather than repeating tests that maybe only differ by the data that they use, we can actually say we don't want just news to be checked. We can actually use a spreadsheet with a column of data and use that data to insert into our test. So let's we've got an artificial spreadsheet here that's been created. I happen to know that there is a column in that spreadsheet called switch. So the spreadsheet may have 200, 300, 100 different rows of data in it. So what we can do is, rather than just using news, we're going to tell this data item to read from a spreadsheet. Now what we can do is then go to our scheduler. We can select our test, tell it to use multiple data items, and it's actually found in that spreadsheet there are 4 rows of data. So you can see in this way that we have now got 4 different data scenarios, but we've only written possibly only one test that is reading in different data at the stage where we're using that data item. Take a quick look at application and configuration tweaks. So under certain circumstances, a company may have an application which has say a German and a US version of their application. We allow different configurations. So we can see here we've got a UK configuration already configured in CodeFuse. Let's just go back to the generic one, and we're going to say that we want to duplicate this login SS step set, and we want to make that available and amendable within the US configuration. So at the moment, if we ran a test against the generic configuration, it would only run this one step. So when we go to the US configuration though, now we have the ability to say I want to add a new step to this. Let's just add in a cell.validate. This is unfortunately fairly arbitrary data, but you can see that the US version has now got 2 steps within this step set, and if we execute that test against this configuration, both of those steps will be executed. Now if we go back to the generic version though, you can still see that there is only 1 step within that step set. So this is very, very useful if you have an application that has certain differences between different configurations or different changes on different environments, for instance. So a good example would be if a UK version of a product has a certain tab but a US version doesn't, then you can set up the system to only validate a certain tab if it's under the US or UK configuration. In this section is just our secondary search ability. So whenever CodeFuse gets the data for a test object, it tries to extract an XPath, an object ID and a CSS selector. Now over time applications may change, and you can either go back and actually edit this data to update it to the latest version, or you can select an option within the CodeFuse scheduler for secondary search. And what secondary search does is it tries to take an XPath that you have previously entered and find a close match for that XPath. So this allows the system to take into account minor changes within your application. And the way that you can use this feature is simply when you schedule a test, you can select use secondary search. Now if secondary search is used within a test, you will see a red flag under information here, which indicates that something has changed within that test run. Now if you don't like the change that's been made with secondary search, you can go to our maintenance screen, see the object list here in terms of what has been changed, and simply click restore archived object, which would revert the object data back to how it was originally before you used secondary search. Spending a little bit of time talking about naming conventions within CodeFuse. Most tests within CodeFuse are perhaps start with a test as the top level. Tests have a number of different step sets in them. step sets have a number of different steps within them, and those steps are reliant on both test objects and test data items. So all of these different assets over time, it can get very confusing with potentially hundreds or thousands of different test data items, objects, step sets, and tests. So it's very useful to come up with a naming convention. So as an example, we already have the ability to name an application, which points you, along with an application and application configuration, points you towards a specific URL for a given web application. But for a test object, perhaps it's not such a good idea to call something, for instance, button A. A much better identifier might be login to indicate that it's on the login screen, username, text box, for instance. So when yourself or another one of your colleagues comes to reuse this asset, be it an object, data item, a step set or a test, they will know instantly what that test asset is, or have a far better idea of it. So in this instance, if we did a search for login underscore, then we can actually find there's actually two objects here which are previous, so one of these has previously been created, but you can find all of the assets using our search facility that relate to a given screen. At this stage, to talk about the way that CodeFuse can group and manage suites of tests, so that they can be really clubbed together in like a folder structure by either grouping them under one suite or by tagging them. So we'll start with tagging. There is a separate video that goes into more depth on tagging, but just for a quick overview here, we will tag this test that we created earlier with the keyword BBC. Now, although that's only one test, we could tag, say, 15 different tests with that keyword of BBC. Now, when we go across to the scheduler, the schedule screen, you'll also notice you have a suites tab. So we can add a tagged test suite, and if we want to run all of the tests which have the BBC tag, we can simply create a tagged test suite, add the tag BBC to that. Now when we go to the scheduler, we can say we want to look at test suites. We've got a tagged test suite called BBC, which we can add. Now once we've added our platform, we could then click on Run Schedule, and any test that had the tag BBC would be run. Now a slightly more simple form of that is a standard test suite. So if we just call this tagged suite 1, in this instance we can just add specific tests to the test suite. And in this instance, if we go to the scheduler, we can say that we're interested in test suites. We add that suite, add a platform, and if we then run and scheduled that suite, those 3 tests that I added to that suite would be run. So again, this is like a grouping or a folder of individual tests that can be updated at any time. It's also worth noting with tagged suites, use of that a number of different times. So if we had a tagged suite called BBC and NBC tests, we could actually add 2 different tags, BBC unfortunately we don't have NBC in this list, but if I just add another tag, you'll give you the idea that we have two different suites here, one of which is making use only of the BBC tag, and this one which will run all BBC tests and NBC tests. It is worth noting as well that we can tag requirements, so we can actually add, say, a BBC tag to this specific requirement, and any linked tests then that are associated with this requirement would then be run. There's more details on how to use requirements tagging in the specific tagging video. This video has shown you the core features of CodeFuse's test management and maintenance features. We hope you found it enjoyable and informative.